Right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining another Balerion Space Ventures podcast. It's April 6th, and today I'm joined with Eric Anderson, the founder and CEO of SynMax, sorry, the company that's working in the sky, frontiering geospatial analytics and intelligence. Very cool company that's working in a very important space that's growing very fast. Eric, thanks so much for being here. Maybe to get things kicked off, I want to know of the aha moment that led to SynMax founding and where you were before this and how you got to the point of seeing such a problem and having such a good solution to wanting to start this company.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Quick point of clarification. I'm a co-founder.
Co-founder, my
And
apologies.
I think, yeah, no worries. No, I mean, it's apologies to my other co-founders, but it plays right into your question, which is, what was the aha moment? So a little bit of background. I was working at a hedge fund called Skylar Capital, and Bill Perkins, the head trader and owner of the hedge fund, who is another co-founder, I think the aha moment really was for him, right? So my job was essentially purchasing data sets, and we'd been doing a lot at the hedge fund related to buying commercial satellite imagery to glean insights into oil and gas assets, their movements, and make more or less profitable trades on them. And Bill really recognized through this myriad of different AI projects that we were doing over 4 years ago, right? So we're not even talking about LLMs. These are deep learning models, right, which were cutting edge at the time, but nobody gets excited about it anymore. That there was a lot of untapped potential, especially in the transformation of turning data into intelligence, right? What's data? What's intelligence? Well, data is ones and zeros. It can be a byproduct of your business. It can be a consumable of your business, or it can be the product you're selling. But it's very unstructured and it's non-homogeneous, and it is a raw material that, by itself, has an uncertain value. It becomes worth something once you can turn it into intelligence, which is the insights that you need in order to achieve what you're trying to do with it. And we recognized very early on that commercial satellite imagery in particular was this underutilized resource of data, right? The proliferation of commercial space over the last 10 years, there's been enormous amounts of Earth observation and other types of privately owned satellites launched into orbit. And it didn't seem like this data was really realizing its full potential. So, SynMax was founded as an entity that specializes not just in commercial space, really in all data, but in that value chain of transforming data into intelligence and selling data intelligence products.
Got it. Now, on the website, one of the mission statements you have is why guess when you can know? What does that philosophy mean in practice?
Yeah, it's pretty on the nose. It's something we used to say back at the hedge fund all the time, right? We were essentially paid to be professional guessers, guessing what the price is going to be tomorrow. But with every single component that leads into trying to figure out what the price might be in the future, there are a lot of assumptions that go into it. And the fewer assumptions you have, right, the better your models can be. So I guess when you can know, it means that we shouldn't be afraid to spend resources and to spend time and investment to get high quality intelligence that goes into building our models. So, give you a couple of stories. Skylar, even though it's a relatively mid-sized energy hedge fund, it had a very outsized research budget, and that goes right back to Bill's vision and kind of the ethos of how we operated over there and how we operated SynMax, which is that we look for the way to get the correct answer to the question, not necessarily the one that everybody else is using. So after a hurricane, right, hurricanes can be very disruptive to energy markets. There can be questions around LNG terminal export capacity, right? Was a terminal materially impacted to the extent that we think it's going to be offline for a long period of time after a large storm passes over? Well, you can do kind of cheap statistical analysis and pull in weather model data and pull in the historical analogs. And of course, we did that too. But you can also find out for yourself. And we often rent helicopters to go look at these things ourselves before everybody else did, so we could have the best intelligence to place trades. That's the same kind of ethos we use at SynMax, which is we're not looking just to see what's kind of available that's cheaply available or easy to get. when we look at building a data intelligence product, right, we think creatively about exploring other opportunities to grab unique and proprietary data sources to feed our models to give our customers the best possible answers so they can come as close as they can to knowing, not guessing.
Got it. And I'm curious how your data pipeline may differ from a typical satellite analytics firm. Like, is there any specific breakthroughs, whether it's AI or image fusion or just proprietary modeling that makes you guys so unique?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest differentiator is that we don't call ourselves a satellite data analytics company. I know there's a number of those, and I don't ever speak bad about competitors or anybody else in the space, but I think one of the biases they might have is they're very hyper focused on one thing, right? Satellite images and what can I do with this satellite image to make something valuable for the world out of it. SynMax, we're focused on the solution to a problem, and we're subject matter expert led. And so, yes, satellite images can play a component in our models, and obviously we've unlocked a lot of capabilities and novel intelligence sources using satellite images, but they're not the right tool for every job. In fact, I think they're really good at one thing, and they're because of the economics and the way that the pricing structure is constructed by satellite companies, they're usually not applied for the one thing they're good at. I mean, think about satellites. If you look at Google Maps, you might get an idea that the satellite is, this crystal clear, perfect, beautiful picture that you can, nearly see the top of people's heads in. But we've all worked in the space industry long enough to know that most commercial satellite imagery is fairly lower resolution, right? Especially when it becomes economically viable to put into a product. And so, the depth of the intelligence is usually not the advantage in a satellite image. And then also look at the latency, right? Most satellites, right, you're going to get an image delivered back in 24 hours. I think, some of the current generation cutting edge stuff, they can get that down to 3 to 6 hours. Some of the next generation stuff is going to be much more instantaneous, but the time advantage isn't necessarily there for satellites either, especially in whatever domain you happen to be operating in. I think a lot of satellite companies and a lot of satellite analytics companies think that satellite operators are competing with other satellite operators. Really, they're competing with the entire sensor set of the Earth, right? So if you are taking satellite pictures of a city, it's probably going to be the worst possible intelligence source you can get because there are thousands of other sensors in the city, right? Everything from near real-time ad tech data to webcams to human intelligence, social media, whatever, right? Where satellites have their biggest advantage is the fact that they're flying around the Earth every 90 minutes. They go everywhere, right? So they're the best sensor in the places where there are no other sensors, right? That's why I think we've been so successful with our MDA product, right? Applying this satellite sensor to the ocean, 2/3 of the Earth's surface is gigantic, is directly taking advantage of satellite's biggest strength, which is its ability to be everywhere, right? And in a domain space like the ocean, the latency requirement doesn't hurt you too much because voyages can last weeks. So having it a few hours late doesn't matter. But I think too many other satellite data analytics companies, although we don't consider ourselves one, they try to focus on use cases where they're directly putting themselves in competition with far better sensors. Whereas SynMax, we're simply looking for the best possible you can know sensor set to deliver a solution.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious about, the total addressable market here for orbital analytics. Is it just commoditized data or is it expanding an intelligence service? How big would you say it is right now? And I guess it's growing so rapidly. Where do you see it going in the next 5 years?
Yeah. So it's difficult to define TAM because what SynMax sells is not single source satellite data analytics, right? They operate as a base layer, and an important layer in a lot of our products, but our products are genuinely intelligence fusion product. Each product has over 50 other data sources that go into it to make it possible. Sometimes those data sources are, contextualizing, right? That can kind of make the data more valuable, right? And attach necessary metadata for you to glean insights into it. Sometimes those data sources are one-offs, right? Like you get a interesting social media post that may be relevant to something, but you're never going to be able to apply to anything ever again. So when I think about total addressable market for space analytics, I mean, I would scope that just to the commercial satellite imagery, right? Because whatever value there is in a satellite image, they're going to capture. Whatever value there is in the immediate analytics on top of a satellite image, right? Apply an object detector on top of it. Apply, some special mapping or inference technology on top of a SAR image, right, to glean additional insights out of it. I think that medium term, long term is absolutely going to be absorbed by those companies, right? That kind of vertical integration for them is so cheap and easy. Like, why wouldn't they take it? So what space is left over, right? The space that's left over is the pure data science maturation of the data into intelligence, right? That's the space that SynMax occupies. And what's the TAM? It's very difficult to say. I'd like to think we're the only ones doing it right now. So the TAM would be whatever value you assign to SynMax. But I think about the potential of it in the terms of the problem that it's solving. And right now, a lot of people have said that we're transitioning from the information age, right, previously the industrial age, into the intelligence age, which is self-serving, right? An intelligence company should do pretty well in the intelligence age. But I think what they mean by that is that the information age, right, was this massive proliferation of ones and zeros, digitization of records, and all of human knowledge, right, being scanned in, all of the huge growth we've seen in IoT sensors and the byproduct data that's been produced by the millions of businesses around the world, right, created the information age. Like, we have a lot of information, we have a lot of data, but that is not necessarily intelligence. And one of the biggest unsolved problems of the information age is the solution of the intelligence age, which is now finally we have the tools at our disposal, and I'm talking about LLMs, right, to industrialize the transformation of that data into intelligence. And that's the space that SynMax occupies and where I see the biggest growth. And I think the TAM, I mean, I don't want to throw specific numbers out that I'm going to regret later, but it is hard for me to think of a business entity on Earth that does not have the problem of data transformation into intelligence, right? We're headquartered in Houston, Texas. Most people don't think of the oil and gas industry as being very sophisticated. They're wrong, right? It's actually an extremely technical field. And the oil and gas industry has been operating for over 100 years, right, from Spindletop until today. The big players, right, and I don't want to name any names because I don't know what NDAs I've signed, but the big oil and gas companies, every single one of them, has the same problem that they have spent billions of dollars trying to solve, and they haven't solved it yet. And that is that they have been accumulating data, right, since Spindletop, right, 1901, all the way until today. Everything from handwritten records, right, to digital scans to actual OCR, clean digital data. They've been accumulating it and spending billions trying to unlock it and glean insights into it. And that's just one industry, one part of the economy that isn't necessarily the most technological part of the economy. The insights that can be gleaned from all of this data that's sitting on the floor right now across the entire world, right? That value add to GDP would be the TAM of the intelligence market.
Gotcha. Yeah. So can you tell us about your ideal customer? And you work across many industries. Maybe give a little example or scenario of how each industry from your ideal customers would use your product.
Sure. So right now we're focused on two verticals. One is finance and the other is government. We've got two products, one that targets each one of them. And those products, the strategy was we brought them in kind of a narrow scope, and then we're growing them out horizontally. Why are those our targets? Because they're our ideal customer, like you're asking about. Our ideal customer is somebody that has a quick translation to seeing the value of intelligence. The finance industry, you can take good intelligence and you can directly turn it into a profitable trade. And you can see the value of that intelligence in your P&L on the trade, right? So they're somebody who's in a natural position to highly value intelligence, and because they recognize its value, they're willing to pay for good intelligence. The second one is government and defense, right? A little bit of a different customer set, but the they have an interest in achieving the best possible mission outcome that they can. And intelligence has a history of being one of the most important essential components for them getting a positive mission outcome. That's why the United States has 18 different intelligence agencies, right? The intelligence is very valuable. And so, that recognition of the value of intelligence makes governments, particularly the US government, a very attractive, ideal customer for SynMax.
Got it. What's the crossover been like with commercial and government over the past 5 years with, this wave of space tech companies and government trying to get more involved, but needing the pace of startups? So you see these partnerships with governments and startups. You see startups working with other startups and having commercial sales. And how's that translate to you? What are they all looking for you? What did it look like at the start, and how's it evolved to up until now?
Yeah. So I think let's start with the differences between each one, right? I think the commercial is much more understandable. Everybody gets it. It's usually a SaaS model, right? Your go-to-market strategy is some combination of marketing, in addition to building out a fully integrated sales team with marketing air cover, and you hire a bunch of smooth, slick talkers, right? You unleash them on your ideal customer profile, and you get this, usually fairly quick translation from investing in a product to translating into sales to upselling, and you get these very smooth revenue curves, and that's why everybody likes to invest in that. And government could not be more different from that, right? Government, first of all, the sales cycles are extremely long, and the actual sales motion is extremely complex. So there's three different components to a government sale. There is the demand signal, right, which is the one that translates over from the commercial world. You need a demand signal. Somebody's got to want your product that you're trying to sell them. But then there's also the contract vehicle and the funding, right? And if you get 2 out of 3, you don't get a sale. If you get 3 out of 3, sometimes you get a sale. And it takes a really long time. So a government sales motion requires, not a traditional sales team that's going to come in and, kind of work as an individual unit and eat what they kill, and, get paid their own individual commission and build their book of business up and their customer relationships and expand. It's going to take a coordinated effort to get all three components of the government sale working together, right, so that you can hopefully have a successful opportunity to provide the government with something valuable. When we started with just the commercial side, right? And we did that deliberately because that was the way for us to get the near-term capital to kind of fund our ambitions to move into the defense market. And the defense side, right, requires a lot more investment. You need that team of people, right, to help you identify the right opportunities in the government, the contracting vehicles, to ensure that there's funding available for these vehicles and to help you generate the demand signal. And the government, to its credit, has come a long way, even in the short period that we've seen them. They absolutely recognize that it is a problem that startups, feel like they cannot provide value to the U.S. government because of how long the acquisition process is. But at the same time, the acquisition process is long and it's very bureaucratic because it needs to be, because it needs to protect itself from bad actors and ensure that the government is always acquiring things that are useful to them. So they've stood up a lot of different helpful programs, and we've investigated and participated in many of them. So, one of them is the Defense Innovation Unit, which is, deliberately going out and looking for technologies in startup companies that could provide value to the U.S. government. And they have some legislative granted authority to be able to accelerate that acquisition process. And there's other ones. The Department of Defense has direct acquisition teams. I think it's called Forged or Forge, that works directly for them and tries to identify these opportunities. And then also there's groups like DARPA, right? as well as there are the things called CRADA agreements, which are very low lift contracting vehicles that defense agencies and the intelligence community can use to try out or and sometimes even pay small dollars for technologies to kind of help companies along their path to selling to the US government. But all in all, it is still an unsolved problem. And it still takes a lot of investment and a lot of time to be able to provide some value to USG.
Yeah. I see a question from the audience. Can you give us a real example?
Of?
I guess if I was a user of your product and, you know, I get it, what next? Do I go on my computer? Is it a software? And what am I looking for? And what kind of scenario would happen where I look back and I'm like, that was such a great idea that I, got SynMax involved because that really helped me out for whatever the use case was.
Oh, sure. So like a use case example. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Just so happens I've got some up on my screen.
Oh,
Can you
perfect. I'd love to
imagine
take
that?
it.
Let's make sure I share the right screen here. Nobody wants to see what I'm running on Claude Code, or maybe you do. Okay, how about this? All right, so I would call this the furthest delivery point that SynMax can make, right? So this is our Thea data set, which is our maritime intelligence product. And our legacy delivery point, or the one that we're delivering to most of our customers right now, is kind of this attributed ship detections. So, SynMax surveys 27 million. In fact, I've got another one of these somewhere up here. There it is. SynMax surveys 27 million square kilometers a day of over ocean imagery with commercial satellite images, right? And then you can bring in another 15 to 25 million square kilometers of other sensor data from space that's also being ingested and pulled in, right? And that isn't including AIS data, which of course is covering the entire, I think, 275 million square kilometers of the ocean a day. That turns into about 99,000 vessel detections. So we have an fully automated AI pipeline that distills all of these different images, and you can see some examples of them down now, in different degrees of blurriness, right, into attributed ship detections. And that's usually where the delivery point stops for most of our customers, right? That provides a certain amount of value to them because now they can track dark vessels, they can track spoofing vessels in the same way that somebody would track a light vessel. If they went to one of the many public websites that will tell you ship locations just based on AIS data. But, it opens up some more interesting use cases, right? Now you can track military and naval vessels, right? Because, they're not going to be broadcasting AIS. You can even look at surface submarines. Every time a submarine pops on the surface, that's something that's detectable with our sensors. Or you can look at dark tankers and cargo. You can look at, spoofing instances, sanctioned cargo locations, right? You can see how commodities are actually flowing around the world when people don't want you to see that. But the delivery point that SynMax is working towards, right, is this, right, where you're actually getting the answer that you want to get. And in this case, this is a intelligence report that was generated by our agentic platform, SynMax Agents, which is essentially an agentic data science tool that we use both internally and externally for customers to be able to glean additional insights out of our data. It allows them to parse through those 99,000 attributed ship detections every single day, which is a literal fire hose of data, and get closer to what they're actually looking for. And in this case, what the customer is looking for is, how is this Iranian vessel supplying solid rocket fuel from China to Iran? And the answer is that it's going dark at the same point every single damn time it heads into the Yangtze River. But then our satellites can still catch it, and they can catch it at the port where it's loading up with solid rocket fuel. And then they go light again once they exit the Yangtze, because it doesn't matter if anybody sees them, and they head back into Iran, right? And there's all kinds of insights in here, and this type of analysis can be done ad hoc. You can talk to our agent and put together reports like this that you can then share, based on your particular use case, or you can set them up to just persistently monitor and look for the types of activity that you're interested in. And that's an example of, here they are loading up with the rocket fuel. A real world example of what you would use SynMax intelligence for.
Can you explain a little bit more about what dark events are and spoofing events?
Sure. Yeah. So they're the two main categories of how a vessel obfuscates its true location. So dark, right? Well, let me back up. There's a thing called an AIS transponder. It was a system developed in the 90s. It was actually originally developed to avoid ship collisions in ports. So what it is everybody has one of these AIS transponders, and they can all talk to each other, and it pings out an unencrypted signal that has a lot of metadata about your vessel. So the identifying information about your vessel, your speed, your heading, your current location. And then it also listens to all the other pings in the area. And it can alert you to when two vessels may be at risk of colliding and advise you accordingly, right? But then in the 2000s on, companies started collecting this data, right? First with onshore antennas to just pick it up and listen to it and store it, because you can get interesting information about the movement of goods around the world. And then more recently with satellite sensors, they can actually capture these things in the middle of the ocean. And there's tons and tons of AIS data now. So AIS is the International Maritime Organization's, enforced, well, not enforced, but required way that every vessel over a certain deadweight tons broadcasts its location so that it can be ensured that it is legally transacting on the ocean. So going dark means you just turn it off. Just flip the switch, right? Now you're dark. Nobody can see what you're doing. You can go wherever you want. Only SynMax can catch you, right? But going dark has become a lot less popular. It used to be the popular way, right? They would just turn it off, and now nobody knows where they are. In comes tip and cue, which is a strategy where you just look for all the signals that went dark, kind of like sending up a flare. I'm about to do something bad. Nobody look over here because I'm turning off my AIS transceiver. And so more recently, it has evolved into spoofing, which is I don't go dark. I don't turn off my signal. I just broadcast a fake signal, right? So in the early days, these signals were, again, really transparent, right? It would all of a sudden, the ship would be moving in a perfect circle or square or even a star pattern. They picked all these patterns, and you could just see them on the map. And a lot of our competitors, who've been in the business longer than us, their bread and butter was they would just, use AI to mass ingest all of these signals, these obvious fake patterns, and then, sell that as a data intelligence product. But spoofing's gotten a lot better. And now you can see, I wonder if I've got an example. I think I do. Yeah, here we go. The Horizon Hope. I'm sorry to call out so many bad-acting ships. Hopefully none of them are going to listen to the podcast, but they deserve it if you ask me. All right, the Horizon Pope is one of our spoofers. All right, so traveling from Venezuela over to Honduras, and then you see right about here, they started spoofing their location. Now, can anybody in the audience tell me if this AIS path right here is fake? Look, it even wobbles a little bit. It's moving around like a real one. This is a very advanced spoofer, right? So this whole path right here is a fake AIS transmission. Never happened. The ship never went there. They're saying they went into, Colombia? Never went there. They're liars. I'll say it. I don't care who hears it. Where they actually went was right here, right? Likely heading over, and we don't, we'll have to wait and see what they do, but likely they're going around the Cape here, and they're probably going back into China with whatever goods they got from Honduras that they don't want everybody to know about. But that's spoofing, and it can be very convincing and very hard to detect unless you have another sensor set that can pick up on it.
So what happens when a spoofing vessel all of a sudden turns back on its transponder and they're halfway around the world? That
Yeah,
raised flags?
that happens sometimes. It does happen sometimes. So I don't know, somebody sets a coffee cup down on the button, you'll get these little pings, they're in their real location, like they just moved at the speed of light. But most of the time they're pretty clever about it, and that doesn't happen. And they will actually have their spoofed location take a different path and meet up with it with their real location and then start correctly broadcasting. We've seen it time and time
Uh,
again. There was a very interesting case that happened at the beginning of this year and at the beginning of last year. Of all of these, I think there's been 13 of them, Chinese origin vessels that all, go from a Chinese port through the Panama Canal, head north, and then the exact same point after they leave the canal, they start spoofing. And they spoof that they're going into Jamaica and they're actually going into Cuba, right? And then you'll see them, they'll leave the Cuban port and then their Jamaican fake path will come and they'll meet up and go back through the Panama Canal. We've seen it 13 separate times.
wow. Yeah, I'm trying to just think of all the activities they might be doing.
Well,
It
we have a
it's
pretty good idea what they're doing. I don't want to freak
yeah.
anybody out, but they're installing signals intelligence in Cuba to spy on American naval bases in Florida.
Wow. So
This is public knowledge.
yeah, with this data, yeah, not a lot of people know about it. I'm sure the government knows about it. Are they doing anything to have enforcements or just label them as bad actors, or do these other people who are spoofing and doing dark events, they just don't care?
A U.S. government intelligence agency happens to be our biggest customer. We'll leave it at that.
Understandably. Okay. So now I'm thinking about how you could apply this to a hedge fund looking at this material. And maybe a use case there as, they're looking at a critical minerals, shipping cargo, container ship, and it's going, and then there's a storm and it gets caught up, and, the hedge fund's the first to know and they're able to do. Is that kind of the tactics they use, or is there some other interesting methods that are out there?
I'll tell you that usually the intersection with finance and maritime comes down to geopolitics, right? So a great example of it right now is the Strait of Hormuz. And sure, everybody's noticed they're paying a little bit more at the pump, right? That's because 30% of the world's oil supply goes through the strait. And the big question is, when is it going to open up for regular ship traffic? And when that happens, there's going to be material movement in the price of oil around the world. And so that's, an immediate use case that I think, our type of data could provide value to. But at the moment, we're not providing it. And that's because at the request of our customers, we're not releasing any satellite imagery detection or derived data from that part of the world as it is an active war zone. And we don't want to put any service members at risk. A more tangible use case, right, would be, sanctioned oil violations, right? Sanctioned oil from Russia or from Venezuela, or any number of, oil-producing countries that have sanctions against them. Those cargoes are moving spoofed or dark, right? And there is a significant percentage of global oil supply that's tied to the sanctioned cargo. And so it's material for the supply and demand of the price of oil globally. Knowing where, and what volumes of dark oil exist in the world helps traders better understand the true S&D balance of oil around the world. I'll give you one more example, and it comes from my background, natural gas trading. And it's a data set we call DTIL, DTIL. So in late 2024, because we're tracking all oil and gas well pads with daily satellite imagery, we noticed that operators had changed their behavior, right? Traditionally, when you develop a well, right, first you clear the land, then you drill it, then you complete it, and shortly after you complete it, you turn it in line, TIL. Flow the hydrocarbons onto pipelines, right? So they can be brought to market so you can start getting paid on that big investment you just made. Well, in late 2024, a lot of them stopped that very last step. They would complete it, but then they would never turn it in line. And what SynMax discovered and what we provided to our customers was that operators seem to be doing this deliberately because natural gas is traded in future contracts. And the price of natural gas at one point, and forgive my son without his shirt on, he doesn't have school out today. So the price of natural gas at one point in time is very different than another point in time, particularly in the US. It is most valuable in the wintertime. And so in the shoulder season, right, which is the fall, operators were delayed tilling, detilling their wells and waiting until they got better prices in the winter because the futures curve was in a very steep contango, which means that the prices, in the future are much, much more expensive than the current prices. And essentially what was happening is that, in the US, we haven't built new underground natural gas storage in 50 years, right? But in that time period, the supply and demand of natural gas, right, even in the last 10 years has gone from 50 BCF a day to over 100 BCF a day. In fact, we're a net exporter to the tune of almost 20 BCF a day of natural gas out of the Gulf Coast and a little bit in the East Coast, right? And that underground storage is the shock absorber for the market, and it flattens the futures curve, right? Because the more you have in the tank, right, the less the spread is going to be between current and future. You can be more deterministic about it. And because the contango curve had gotten so extremely out of whack, right, it incentivized what we call a form of virtual storage, where operators are basically saying, I'm going to keep this gas ready to deploy by delaying my turned-in line. And essentially, they're serving the market, right? The need for storage. So we tracked it, and we started tracking it to the extent that we even hired private investigators to go out and investigate, what was going on at these wells. But then we also used high-resolution SAR and satellite imagery to keep persistent tabs on them, and gave our customers signals the second that they turned their detilled wells into tills, so that while the rest of the market without this intelligence believed that there simply was not the storage, right, our customers knew that there were multiple BCFs, right, of virtual storage ready to be deployed on the market, and we gave them the signal as soon as it was coming.
Wow. So tell me about the actual images and data that you're using. Like, where does that image come from? Where is that camera, and who owns it?
Yeah. So, we partner with and procure an enormous amount of satellite images from a huge number of different satellite operators. I think it is advantageous for us to partner and procure in certain cases, and it's advantageous for us to deploy our own type of sensors in other cases, right? And really, when you have a well-diversified marketplace of sensor data that is generally commoditized, it makes sense for us to procure it. And when you have sensor data that doesn't exist, right, or there are economic barriers to getting it, it makes sense to try and get it yourself. So, I think AI disruption, a narrative I've been hearing a lot because we're going through our Series A right now. I've had a lot of VC calls, right, is a very valid story. But I think that a lot of the market's reaction to it is just 50% of the answer, right? So I've heard a strong thesis for companies that are data companies, which is how we would be classified in the VC community, to create a defensive moat, because Claude is going to make everything you do disappear, right? There's this compression. And so that would be a form of defense, right? To try and, lock up some type of proprietary data source. And then, if you have Claude, if you don't have Claude, you can still capture the value because you're the only one who has it. I can't think of a single example where that has worked in history for anything more than the medium term, right? Because all you do is you increase the spread, and you incentivize competitors to come in with other signal sources. And space access is pretty simple, right? Launch costs continue to fall, and commercial satellite companies are prolific. So I don't know why that would be a sustainable advantage. Nevertheless, right, SynMax does look at those type of opportunities on a case-by-case basis. I think the 50% of the story that is being missed is the offensive component, which is, oh my God, this is a tool, right? These LLMs, these agentic systems, that if you're willing to lean into that technology early, right, you can move your delivery point forward. Instead of just selling a refined, homogenized data set, you can sell your customers what they actually want, right, if you're thinking about it. I know I strayed a little bit from your original question about where our data comes from, but Yeah, I don't want to answer it without giving you the context of our larger strategy.
Yeah, and it rolled into my next question, which was about the barrier of entry of this just lowering with more and more space data available and LLMs and AI agents getting, more and more powerful every 2.5 weeks at this point.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it begs the question of how do you build such a defensible moat? And the IP is one thing, but who knows how much that's going to prevent. Um, I feel like getting a good head start on this would be, working with governments and maybe having clearance and being able to help these new projects. But I could see a future where, uh, a college student can make this in his dorm over a weekend, maybe not to the extent of what yours does, but maybe to track one thing.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's powerful, right? So um, I think all businesses like SynMax, in fact, I think all businesses in general need to look at this as both a threat and an opportunity. The threat is exactly what you said, Aidan, which is that we have industrialized software development, and that includes software development for data science. So, yes, the college student in their dorm room can now make a platform and they can make a data ingestion model and they can make a full pipeline, right? Okay, so if that's the value add you're bringing to the world, right, that is just compressed dramatically down to almost nothing. Um, but it's an opportunity too, right? So one of our biggest moats is, first of all, our historical data, right? We have 4 years of data, right? Nobody can go back in time and acquire because SynMax already has it. And anybody who wants to be able to take you to an intelligence insight, right, has to have the history to be able to do that. That's a moat, but that is a 4 year moat, right? Because somebody else in 4 years could then have 4 years. Of course, I have 8 years, but right, that delta overall is shrinking. Eventually, it doesn't matter as much. The opportunity is to restructure your company to be one that takes advantage of this enormous leverage that's been granted to everybody, and do that in two ways, right? So internally, we've rebuilt our development teams, right? Carved them up into smaller groups, right, that can work individually on just features or just standalone products and offerings, because that's where we've seen the biggest leverage point on AI development. I think early on, everybody saw these AI coding tools come out, and they said, "Wow, we need to be an AI first company," right? And what that mostly meant was, um, hey, your job is you're an API engineer. Okay, I want you to do that, but I want you to use Claude Code or Cursor or Windsurf for Copilot, right? And okay, your job is a back-end engineer. Yeah, do that same thing, but use these tools, right? And I think that's almost ubiquitous at this point. Everybody's done that. But the point still stands. Why is it that a college student in their dorm room can make an entire platform in a weekend, but your team, who now is AI first and has all these tools, is only about 20% more efficient than they were before? And it's because true AI restructuring has to be done at the structural level, right? Um, Software development has been a science, right, since its instantiation. And we've gotten all of these very advanced frameworks out of it, from agile to waterfall to extreme programming and all the different software development methodologies to make teams more efficient. None of them work in an AI development world. Throw all of them away, right? Because you cannot have a software development team operating AI first in a structure of a pre-AI world. You have to find the new way to build your team so that they can really create a leverage point out of all of this. And that's what we found. And the sad part is, there aren't any books you can buy from O'Reilly that will tell you how to structure one of these teams. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. But we have, and we're pretty happy with the results we're seeing so far. So, internally we leverage ourselves, but then the second component is externally. You need to move your delivery point further up the value chain, right? The compression is happening, but the compression is happening early in the value chain, right? So, if you're receiving data here and you're delivering to customers here, and there's a compression in this part, and you're left with this part of the value chain, right? One way for you to be able to get your piece back and even increase it is to move your delivery point using these tools. And that's exactly what we've done. So, our agentic platform allows our customers with our data sets to be able to get all the way to the insights that they're trying to glean out of the data instead of just connecting them to an API, right? Giving them documentation on what the data looks like and wishing them good luck, which is the way that this business has been forever.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the future, the next layer. Is there a future where, this technology is used not just for Earth, but for in space and tracking other satellites? We have close to 20,000 satellites up there, and that number is growing incredibly fast. And they're not all US satellites. So I could see a world where, we want to be tracking, and of course, there's space domain awareness, space situational awareness, and other forms to track those satellites. But could we start seeing maybe events like we saw with those spoofing and those dark moments that ships have in space? And could your technology be applied to that?
Um, Absolutely. So, yeah, space domain awareness, right? Any type of intelligence awareness is absolutely uh, a great candidate for a SynMax style solution. And you're absolutely right that space is not only becoming more crowded, but it's becoming more contentious. Um, I attended a talk a couple of years ago that was talking about the change in U.S. military power as measured with different criteria, right? And there were a lot of members of armed services in the audience, and so the speaker, hey, show of hands, right? Who here's Navy? Who's your Army? Who's your Air Force? Who's your Space Force, right? Um, and okay, now how many vessels were in the Navy 20 years ago versus how many today? Okay, Army, how many tanks were there 20 years ago versus today? All right, Air Force, how many, on and on down the list, right? And in every single case, the number was smaller today than it was 20 years ago, right? Okay. Now, how would you rank America's military power 20 years ago versus today? Across the board, America has far greater military capabilities than it did. Yes, it has fewer, by almost every metric, types of resources to deploy. And the answer is that every resource has become exponentially more capable than it was just a short time ago. And in large part because of space, right? We have precision munitions, we have precision intelligence, we have precision just across the entire spectrum that has enabled our capabilities. And so this has made space both an opportunity and a threat, right? And it has also made it a battlefield in a hypothetical war in the future, right? Space-based assets are fair targets to diminish an enemy's capability. And so there is a lot of interest in tracking the activities of space and the potentials for adversaries to disable or interfere with your capabilities in the space domain. You said it first. It's called space domain awareness. It is a new problem set, one that SynMax hasn't directly participated in, but one that we've definitely thought about, and we see a very strong demand signal from U.S. government and our allies for.
Just thinking about this with, everything growing exponentially, and we just have all this data. In a world of infinite data, what actually matters most?
I'm going to talk my book. Thanks for the nice setup. Yeah. I'd say that, data by itself isn't worth anything at all. It's intelligence, right, that you can get actual inferences from. Data can be, data by itself without inference is a problem. It's a liability, not an asset. It's something you have to pay to store, something you have to maintain. It's only when you find the mechanism to unlock it into an insight that it becomes worth anything at all.
Yeah. And 5 years out from now, what's the world going to look like? And how do you think things are going to be changing? Are there things that matter now that you just don't see mattering in the future, and things that aren't really talked about now that are really going to matter in the future?
Um, I think there's, I think there is a dominant narrative about the future that is wrong, especially as it relates to the AI revolution, right? Um, I think that a lot of people make the argument that flows very logically, right? Okay, um, Eric has this job. That job can now be done by Claude Code, right? Eric won't have that job in the future. My God, how many people like Eric are there? Oh, there's millions, right? Tens of millions, hundreds of millions. Oh my God, what a bleak and horrible future we're headed for. There's going to be these kings who own the companies, and they're going to replace everybody with Claude Code, and they're going to capture all the value of the world. And then there's going to be the peasants who are the rest of us, right? It's an argument uh, made convincingly by Karl Marx, right? Who talked about the means of production and the proletariat, and this idea that there has to be some type of overriding mechanism to control this, otherwise we can all see where it's going. And it's an argument that happens to be wrong, right? Because it has a fundamental flaw, which is that um, first of all, that humans have reached their full potential and in their ability to provide value, that everybody is sitting in a job that is the most they could possibly achieve, and they couldn't possibly achieve any more with better tools. And second of all, that there's some type of cap on GDP and human ambition. Okay, the U.S. creates 30 something, 40 something $trillion of value a year in GDP. So if some portion of that goes to AI, right, then there's less of a portion left for everybody else, and that's stupid. I think AI is a tool of leverage. I think we're going to grow to over 100 trillion in GDP because every individual is now going to be leveraged to be able to perform, better and more significant work because of AI. Now, does it mean that the disruption is not going to be difficult? Absolutely. And people who are in roles where they can do something about it should be thinking about how we manage this disruption. I've told everybody at SynMax, no one is going to lose your job to AI. And I absolutely mean that, right? Um, but you could lose your job to somebody who uses AI if you don't. And that's just a reality. The expectations of what value we provide today is very different than the value from 100 years ago, right? 100 years ago, maybe the Erics of then were farming fields, right? And 95% of the country worked in agriculture. And, that was, it took 95% of us to feed 100% of us, right? That's not a lot of excess value creation. And today, 2% work in agriculture. So it only takes 2% to feed everybody. And we've put ourselves to more productive uses, ones that they couldn't imagine 100 years ago. So I think the same thing stands true today. Yeah, it's very hard to imagine what the jobs of the future are going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, God, 100 years from now. But, there is a consistent underlying pattern of, humans always find ways to put ourselves to productive uses.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. This whole conversation has been so interesting. Eric, thank you so much. I want to leave
Yeah,
it with,
thanks for having me.
from what we've spoke about, anyone listening, if they were to have one big takeaway from our conversation, what would you want them to walk away with?
Oh, gosh. I guess it depends on who your audience is. That SynMax is doing their Series A, and God, that looks like a great investment. I don't know. I think I'd want your audience to recognize that data and intelligence sit inside of their own value chain, which I think is a new idea. I think data has been referred to just semantically as data, right? And it just like it's this homogenous thing, and all the terminology has evolved around it, right? Oh, there's a data lake and there's a data server, and like, there's a lack of understanding and appreciation for the maturation of data into something that is actually useful. And it's an entire ecosystem, it's an entire market. And I believe that it is going to be one of the dominant markets and sectors of the economy as we transition from the information age into the intelligence age. Everybody has a data problem, and there is an insatiable appetite for intelligence, not just in finance and government, but across the entire economy. And I'll leave it with that.
Well said. Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's been a great conversation, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot for having me. Take care.
Take care.